Welcome to the Great Work of Your Life interview series produced by Revealing Genius. Our guest today is the CEO and founding physician of the Osteopathic Center for Healing, a leader in functional and integrative medicine. This remarkable center goes beyond traditional healthcare, addressing a wide array of conditions, including chronic illness, musculoskeletal issues, and even the effects of aging. Personalized wellness model combines traditional and alternative methods, all designed around the patient's unique needs and lifestyle. And get this, at the center, the patient truly has a voice. And I can attest to that. The folks at the center focus on uncovering the underlying causes of disease, which can often go overlooked in conventional care, and support the body's natural ability to heal itself through advanced preventative health technologies. So get ready for an eye-opening conversation about what it truly means to secure your well-being and enjoy a life of vitality. Please welcome Dr. Neil Spiegel.
Thank you.
So happy to have you here, Dr. Spiegel. We're going to jump right into the questions. You're very, very busy, so I'm so happy to have caught you on your lunch hour. So the first question is, what gives you energy and what drains your energy?
So I guess what gives me energy is the feeling that I can make a difference in people's lives and change for the better. What drains me is obviously having to kind of sometimes navigate our crazy healthcare system to get patients what they need, because sometimes that can be very frustrating for the patient as well as for the staff. And sometimes we can't always get what we want.
Agreed. Well said. And you've been in practice since 1991. You've been focusing on empowering individuals to take a closer look at how they live. You equip them with practical strategies for change. It's all about understanding and optimizing daily habits. From what I have seen, it is the great work of your life. So, what do you love the most about the great work of your life, and what do you like the least?
So I guess that goes back to how do you make change, right? How do you influence people, and how do you treat conditions that other people or other doctors or other clinicians have failed? Because most of the time patients are coming to me, I wouldn't say all the time, but most of the time it's predominantly patients who have kind of gone to different providers and haven't gotten the solutions that they would like. So they're frustrated. So getting them better when other people have failed is a big issue, especially when they've come back to you and say you've changed my life. Especially when a patient says I'm no longer taking medication for my pain. So that's a big driver. And what was the second part of the question? What?
It was actually the opposite. So, what do you love the most and what do you like the least?
So what's always happened with healthcare is this kind of documentation stuff that we have to do. And some of the times I'd like to just have my thoughts appear on paper rather than me having to type them in. But of course we have to type them in. So a lot of times what I have to do whenever I'm preparing to see a patient, especially follow-up, is I have to do a lot of my grunt work before the patient comes in. So I'm not busy doing that in front of the patient. So I'm totally engaged instead of sitting there doing my silly documentation, which I think is helpful because the patients know that I'm engaged with them and know that I'm not just sitting there in front of my laptop typing in information. So
Makes sense.
But the documentation is a necessary evil. So it's not like there's not for any lack of reason for it. It's just that it's not something I'd like to do.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes perfect sense. And I'm sure the folks that are listening right now can certainly relate to that. This next question is the question, if I had 5 minutes with you, Dr. Spiegel, and I could only ask you one of the dozen or so questions we have today, this would be the one. And it is, when did you realize, was there a moment in time or was there some kind of trigger when you just knew like you knew what the great work of your life would be?
That's a very, very good question. And I think, when I've gone through different steps of my training, I always, being a DO, and most people kind of, I guess, maybe more aware of osteopaths now, but when you go back 30 years, it was a little bit more of a fight, that, for respect in the medical community, as we were thought of as, we used to make fun. We were Avis and not Hertz. We were second best. So because we were second best, we had to try harder, which was, I think that was Avis's motto years ago, was we're second, so we have to try harder. And I think, getting to each step of where I was, um, I had to find creative ways in which I was able to get, the education that I eventually got when I was one of the first ever DOs at NYU, and I was one of the first non-family physician sports medicine fellows at Michigan State, and then I came to Maryland, where there were very few DOs, and had to kind of create a sense of community where people understood what I did, and I wasn't some quack, which is all frequently bantered about. Um, and then having the ability to kind of see physicians as patients or MDs, and them understanding what I did firsthand and why I was different, was a kind of a beginning step of kind of knowing, okay, I'm different. How do I kind of march that out in real time? And then, of course, as we all know, in the late 90s and early 2000s, we started having an opiate crisis, which kind of, I guess, blossomed probably in, I don't know, 2010, 2012, somewhere in there. Um, and being in a position that I was in, is having this kind of niche of alternative strategies to deal with pain, was playing into a lot different audience now that people had soured on opiates for obvious reasons, giving credence to kind of things like manipulation and acupuncture and alternative strategies as functional medicine and regenerative therapies, et cetera, which were all kind of, I don't want to say goofy, but people kind of like, poo-pooed a lot of it as quackery, because there wasn't, quote unquote, peer-reviewed medical journals with research, et cetera, which kind of hampered a lot of it over the years, because there was really no kind of interested pharmaceutical company, because there was no money at the end of the rainbow for these these studies. So a lot of the studies were kind of more anecdotal stories or small numbers of patients, et cetera, et cetera. So the traditional doctors didn't buy in. So it took time. And eventually, I said, the community started turning around when there were more and more numbers and more stories and more kind of peer-related review articles and things about the success stories of patients. And I guess it became the kind of, this is my passion, this is where I'm going. And I think that kind of, I guess, summarizes it in some ways.
Yes, and I've had the pleasure of reading through some success stories from really long time loyalists. These are patients who have they've pledged their allegiance to you for decades, and their families. And the transformations that have occurred are truly remarkable. And following on to where you were kind of new, especially in Rockville, Maryland. One of the first DOs in the space. You're kind of a pioneer. Um, did you ever have like doubts or freak out moments about the great work of your life?
You always have doubts. We all doubt ourselves. That's probably, I mean, that goes through my head probably all of the time, right? It's like you come out with something and you pray that it kind of reaches the right audience in the right way. that people aren't going to look down on you. Um, Medicine tends to be not kind to people that are, leaders and thought leaders, etc. There are many examples of that in medicine. We experienced, I think, a lot of that during COVID, where people were saying things that were true one day and false the next because the science changed, and finger pointing happened, which is so typical that that would occur in grand rounds all the time. So we would see that in real life, and doctors have experienced that plenty of times. And a lot of times I would get embarrassed for the person that was doing a talk because they were being attacked by somebody in the front row. Scientists do that more than anyone else, I think. I don't know why that is, but they like to, that one guy in the front row always likes to be the one that seems to kind of tear down the science of what the person is presenting. So I always kind of fear that somebody's willing to kind of wanting to tear me down, especially the traditionalists who don't see value in what we do. It's kind of disheartening, especially, you're treating a patient that's been labeled with dementia and they don't have dementia. And the neurologist is basically calling you a quack. That's, and I have to kind of rally the patient, and they believe you, and they don't believe the neurologist after a while, but it takes a little bit of guts.
Indeed, to persevere through that for sure. And I mean, I'll go on record to say that I have read some of the testimonials from your patients, and they are the word I'm searching for is moving. It's it's moving. It's highly emotive, where folks say that, because they came to the osteopathic center for healing, the trajectory of their life has changed for the better, which is, and that's the norm across the success stories that I'm reading. So it lends itself to the next question. Dr. Spiegel, you have been able to experience some amazing success stories. So how do you define success?
So how do I define success? The patient defines it for you, I think, right? So every time we go through something, I say, look, this is a journey. We're going to have bumps and grinds, and we're going to have to kind of, figure out a way to make this better. And not everything is going to work for you. I have to kind of think about plan B and plan C and plan D. And as long as I have those different options, you got to bear with me. And the success comes when you start asking those initial questions. When I do my initial interview, which is usually about 90 minutes long, and I start asking different questions about quality of life measures. How do you sleep? Can you exercise? Can you walk? Can you go to work? Can you sit in front of a computer? How is your libido? Are you happy with the way your body looks? I mean, and you go back, how much medication are you using to manage your pain? So when you go back, a lot of times people forget because they focus on what's still going on versus where they came from. So if you say, how do I define success? Well, the patient says, I'm not taking any medicine for my pain anymore. I'm able to walk a half hour. I'm able to sleep through the night. So I think you measure it by quality of life indicators that you pick up on when you first see the patient, and you start asking those questions.
Indeed.
And then you redefine them as the game goes on, and you say, oh, this is better, this is better, this is better, this is better.
Yes. And I had the pleasure of speaking with some of your patients, and a lot of them describe you as a professor, which I think is kind of interesting. So this next question is kind of fun. It's the 10,000 hour question. It's your superpower question. Where do you think you've spent 10,000 hours honing your superpower?
So I guess my kids always say I'm like Dr. House. Like the old TV show Dr. House. It's like I'm not going to stop until I figure out what the underlying cause is. So I think my passion is to kind of like the puzzle, figuring out the puzzle. Something is making all this tick. And once we figure that out, everything else is going to get better. But I have to keep digging and figuring it out. Sometimes the patient comes up with that kind of signature moment where they say X. And I'm like, wait a second, say that again. Like, what? I said, you just said something. I'm like, say that again. And then they say it again. I'm like, that's it. That's the problem. And they don't even realize what they're saying. So, well, nobody's ever really even thought about that before. I was like, well, that's why we're here. So it's like that signature kind of moment, trying to get to that moment of, and I think a lot of it is allowing the patient that comfort to just talk. And sometimes, patients say, well, I don't know if this is relevant, but I said, no, tell me. And say, why? I said, because anything you say might be a clue to the puzzle. It's kind of, I'll give you an odd circumstance. This is totally unrelated, but I think it's kind of, delves into this whole strategy. It's like a patient tells me they figured out that they're allergic to the banana peel, but not the banana. And I'm like, how did you figure that out? It's like, well, if somebody peeled the banana for me, I can eat it and have no problem. But if I peeled it myself, I'd get an allergic reaction. So that's kind of like what a simplified version of like figuring it out. It's like the patterning of what we do is not always so easy because there's too many variables, right? And those variables make it hard to definitively say, oh, cause and effect, right? Causation is always not easily defined in medicine. A lot of it's correlation, right? So we don't know. It might be 2 or 3 factors. We don't know that either.
Yeah, it's so what I'm hearing, it's connecting the dots. It's asking the right questions and connecting the dots to get
right.
to that quality of life is your definition of success.
Quality of life is definition of success. Everybody, the reason they're coming to the doctor is because their quality of life is not good. That's why they're there. Or a lot of people are now, especially younger people, are coming to the doctor because they're saying, I don't want to be like my parents. I want to make change now. Like people are willing to kind of say, okay, my mom had heart disease, my dad had heart disease. They suffered. I don't want to be that.
Yeah, makes sense.
Fix me before that happens.
Yeah, definitely. If you had to do it all over again, Dr. Spiegel, is there anything you would do differently? What would that look like?
So nowadays, I think my training would be different because things have changed. Medicine, every 3 to 6 months, things change. So the ability to kind of get training today is very different. So a lot of my skills were learned after I finished my training. My formal training. So if I had to do anything different, I would want to acquire those skills before I went into clinical practice. I know that's kind of like, I guess the doctors today will say that in 20 years that they didn't get all the skills they needed because things change. But I guess formalizing that would have been probably better. But other than that, I wouldn't change.
Yeah, and I understand you actually are the go-to for many students where you actually shepherd the process. You're actually training our rising stars, the up and comers. You're training students to practice medicine. Yes?
Yes. Yeah. So it's very interesting. Like a lot of students will come, and one of their biggest complaints of doing their what they call clinical clerkships, clinical rotations, which are 3rd and 4th year students, is what I predominantly see. A lot of them will say most of the rotations that I go on, the doctor really doesn't pay much attention to me. I'm just observing them. And I'm like, well, you're not going to learn that way. Right. So the key to teaching any student is to kind of get them to think outside, even though they might not know the answer. And it was, it was a kind of a way I almost with my children. I would ask them to think about stuff, even though I knew they didn't know the answer. And my wife would always yell at me. It's like, why are you asking them that? I said, because if I ask them that and they think about it and then I tell them the answer, the next time somebody asks them the question, they'll know the answer
Yeah, brilliant.
because they connected. And I think that's the way I teach my medical students. I ask them questions that's above their pay grade, right? But they have loose knowledge, right? They have some facts. So they can kind of formulate at least a theory in their mind of what the answer may be. And then when I tell them the answer, they're like, oh, or I tell them, let's go home tonight. I want you to research blah, 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 blah. And then they go and they look, and I said, let's talk about it tomorrow. And then they have a connection to a clinical case that they're seeing and some kind of notion of like what's out there and what it all means.
Yes, and in interviewing some of your patients, many of them said that what they really respect the most about you is that you're cutting edge. Like you always seem to be ahead of the curve, like just a little bit ahead of the curve. Like for example, I noticed that you offer aesthetics. You hired an amazing physician assistant that is addressing hormone imbalance for women. So so tell me the answer to this next question. It's an interesting one. What do you know about yourself to be absolutely true?
I have to be honest, right? That's no question about it. It's like when a patient asks me something, what do you think the outcome's going to be? And I say, and a lot of times doctors will overstate things, and I think they get in trouble, right? Oh, I think this is going to work for you. It's like, this is what I think, 100% honest. And I try to be economically mindful of trying to help a patient make a decision. I don't want it to be about me making money. I want it to be about having the patient make the right decision. If it's a surgical condition, I'm the first one to say, this is surgery. I don't think I can help you. And I think honesty is so important. Don't mislead the patient. It'll come back to haunt you every time.
And you offer a concierge model, which I think is really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? It's a business model, but it's really based on your philosophy of care, where my understanding is that it's more congruent with your philosophy of how to deliver healthcare. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Obviously, I'm physical medicine and rehab. That's my basic training. I'm not a family doctor. Now, despite that, I've had a lot of primary care training along the way, in addition to being board certified in functional medicine, which is a lot of internal medicine. What typically happens, and I'll give just an example, the patient comes in and has the typical lab test of like their cholesterol, and they think they're fine. And I said, 50% of people that are in the ICU of a heart attack have normal cholesterol. And the reason for that is that there are other reasons why people have heart attacks. So even though they're maybe on a statin or a diet or something of that nature, that doesn't mean they're totally risk-free of having a heart attack. So the wellness model, which kind of integrates with my belief system of wellness in general, is trying to figure out, okay, is there underlying causes of illness that we could see before they happen? Oh, you're pre-diabetic. Well, what should I do, doctor? Don't eat sugar. Well, that's not a great answer. You're not diabetic yet. How do we address that? So primary care should really be about figuring out the underlying causes of illness before they happen, and then trying to institute a treatment plan to change lifestyle, and then giving the patient objective measures and looking at them again and seeing that they're better. So looking at an inflammatory marker, looking at insulin resistance, looking at cholesterol, looking at C-reactive protein, looking at cortisol, stress hormone markers, et cetera, and being able to kind of target them as underlying risk factors for illness, and then looking back at them when you've kind of tried to promote change. I think that should be a primary care model, not waiting till the patient gets sick and then just referring them out to the different specialties, which it's become the kind of gatekeeper of like, okay, which specialty do you need to go to? And I don't think that the primary care needs to kind of change. So the functional medicine model kind of changes that paradigm of kind of, okay, let's look at these markers, let's follow them, let's try to influence change, and let's see if we can keep you away from illness and keep you living longer and healthier, which I think what primary care should be.
Yeah, absolutely. We have 3 more questions before we pause for the final question. This next question is kind of a fun one. What would people be surprised to know about you?
One of the things everybody's always surprised to know about me is that I'm passionate about music, even though I don't play an instrument. And they don't have me as kind of like this person who kind of knows all this like silly, stuff about music that's kind of esoteric. So that would be one. I guess the other one is that I grew up in a very kind of a small town in suburbia, Long Island, where people were of modest means. I didn't grow up wealthy. I grew up, my mom used to say, I grew up with enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so, I grew up in a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house,
Yeah.
less than a 2,000 square foot home on a little quarter of an acre in suburbia.
Love
Um,
it.
and so I think people are like, oh, really? That's how you grew up? I'm like, yeah, that's how I grew up. My dad was a aviation mechanic, and my mother was a bookkeeper.
Wow.
And
Great story. I did not know that about you. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. So these next 2 questions, we need your advice. You recommended an amazing book to me. I devoured it in a weekend. It was called Life Force, by Tony Robbins. He wrote it with 2 physicians, which I thought was really, really good and very relevant to the work that you do. So what's a book that inspired you to behave or think differently?
I mean, Life Force, a lot of times I read that book and I thought that stuff in the book I already knew, but it was just kind of reinforcing of what I already kind of knew.
It's like, what's your favorite book, but kind of like 10xing it? So, what's a book that literally inspired you to behave or think differently? Like Life Force for me, it just completely opened my eyes about regenerative medicine, which is one of your specialties. I was fascinated by it. It was, I mean, is, and just the transformations that patients have experienced because of that practice. So, yeah, we're looking for your advice.
I can't remember the author, but the name of the book was From Good to Great. I think that's a change management type of book. He talks about the 5 levels of leadership in the book, and he gives examples of different corporations. And I kind of had to kind of place myself there, and I'm like, okay, who am I? And if you're going to leave a legacy, how do you leave a legacy? And I think you leave a legacy by training other doctors, which is kind of the classic Paying It Forward, which was another book I read. I forget the name of that book, Paying It Forward. How do you influence that? And how do you influence change so that you have a legacy? And I think the best leaders were the ones that were able to leave a corporation and have it grow and stay where it was, right? Those were called level 5 leaders, that they really didn't need to be the leader anymore. They almost like negotiated themselves out of a job, so to speak. So I think that education. I've always believed that educating my patient, educating other doctors, educating the future. Right. I want somebody to be my doctor. I think so. That's like a non-medical book.
Perfect. That's perfection. Excellent. And it does kind of dial into why I started the great work of your life, the interview series, because I really do believe that when people are tuned in, tapped in, turned on to, what it is they love to do, they will leave seventh generation impact. Like their legacy will live beyond them if they can dial into it. And you are a perfect example of this. So my last question before we pause and then we do the bonus question is, do you have a favorite quote or a mantra that you live by? And this would be something that you would put on your tombstone, you would tattoo it to your forearm, you'd write it in sky writing in an airplane. Like what would that be?
So I think I've quoted you this before. I said the educated patient has the best outcome. I mean, that's been my mantra. If I educate the patient, they'll make change and they'll have the best outcome. I just wanted to say one other thing about medical students that makes me feel good that I've established change. Is like when I go to a meeting and there are maybe 40 people in the room and 10 of them have been former students of mine that come up to me and thank me for helping them in their life. And then you say, okay, I've made an impact. Out of 40 people, 10. That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. That's really good. And that's the game, right? Is having impact. Like that, there is no other game. Like that is the game. That's why we
Right.
get up in the morning. That is the game. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. That's exactly what we want to inspire here on Great Work of Your Life. So thank you for that. And I think we have our soundbite for this particular interview. The educated patient has the best outcome. I've heard you say it many, many, many times. I'm dying to know the answer to this question, Dr. Spiegel. So if a higher power would let you, I'll put higher power in air quotes, whatever you deem that to be. If your higher power would let you do, be, have, see anything, and there are no limits. There's no financial limits, no mindset limits, no geographical limits. Like there are no limits. There's no boundaries. What would you do, be, have, or see if you literally had had everything at your disposal to go ahead and do that?
That's a good question. I mean, everybody would, if you had to kind of do that, of course, everybody wants to have peace in the world, right? I mean, that would
Yes.
be the ultimate. I don't know if that's the cop-out answer, but I would say, we should treat everybody with respect and kindness, and we all have the same goal, right? Everybody wants to raise their families in peace and live their lives the way they want to live their lives, and without anybody judging them or killing them or destroying their goods or stealing from them. And I mean, that would be the ultimate if I was able to wave the magic wand. But if the question was like more of a practical one, it's like, and we kind of droned it down to kind of our work and what we do is if you think about the fact that our food supply in America, as bad as it is, I would like to eliminate the powers that be that have too much influence over feeding us stuff that basically are killing us. This needs to change. If I didn't have, or the world didn't have the influence of the sugar lobby and the wheat lobby and the corn lobby and Monsanto and Bayer and all these other people that feed us chemicals and wonder why we have all these medical problems. That's a more practical one.
Yeah, and still a big one. I mean, it's still a large hill to climb for sure. And we talked about just recently, Dr. Mark Hyman testified in front of Congress about that very thing. So there is a movement starting, I think. We just need more folks like you to raise awareness. Maybe a TED Talk is in your future.
Sounds good.
Wonderful. Well, friends, you can find more information at drneilspiegel.com, NEILSPIEGEL.com, or go ahead and Google Osteopathic Center for Healing. I Googled it right before we got onto this call, and it is the first one to pop up in Rockville, Maryland. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for listening in today. And thank you, Dr. Spiegel, for being our guest.
Thank you.